Hello, everybody, and welcome to this odd presentation of our lecture that we were supposed to have on Thursday that is going to look at a variety of topics related to the different types of studies that you could potentially run. I'm sorry for having to present it in this particular format, but with the last second issue, I figured this was better than kind of putting stuff back and having a huge adjustment on the schedule for anybody. What we're going to see, though, is a slightly condensed version of what we're going to be covering in this class. One, because it doesn't make sense to have lots of discussions, and two, because it's awkward to try to present stuff in this particular medium. So you'll see that this is much less than the hour and 10, 15 minutes that we typically take for our lectures. But I promise we'll still get to everything that we were going to be covering in that class, minus the discussion portion of things. So let's get started. Let's say you've decided that you've wanted to kind of pick a very specific topic that you want to study for your particular project. You've probably thought of a bunch of different things that you could potentially look at, and probably some things that you might be able to conclude based on the different types of results that you were going to find. But what type of data are you going to specifically collect? What types of results are you going to report? This is what we're going to start getting into not only in this class, but the next couple classes. In today's class, we're going to focus on the big difference between two types of research that we call quantitative research and qualitative research. Most of our day will be dedicated to talking about the quantitative research side of things, since that's what most psychology research eventually is, and it's what most of your statistics classes will focus on. But I want to first briefly talk about qualitative research, research that focuses primarily on descriptive observations of a very limited number of individuals, if not just one individual that's interesting to note. We're looking for why we look at qualitative research in occasional settings in psychology. We're looking at really with this qualitative research is exploratory stuff. It's giving us a chance to really understand something that's either untested or completely unique. When we're running qualitative research designs, we can either look at a large amount of information, create some summary of an individual, maybe get a narrative on what they're all about, or we could potentially just focus our attention on some particular aspect of an individual, talking about a quality that they possess or something that's unique to them that might be worth exploring later on. Now, oftentimes when people talk about qualitative research, they stress that it can't really have lots of numbers tied to them. This is technically true, but just because you're looking at numbers being reported doesn't mean you're automatically looking at quantitative research. Or the occasional qualitative studies that do focus on maybe just one or two numbers that relate to a description about, again, an individual or some particular group of people. These are sometimes called case studies, but there's some other ways that this qualitative research does pop up. So I don't want to tether the term case studies directly to qualitative research in this particular class. If we're looking at quantitative research, the thing that, again, most psychologists focus on, this particular approach to understanding information about either groups or kind of data within groups can come in a variety of different forms. One of the classic types of quantitative research that's out there, that's sometimes discounted in stats classes because it's a lot easier to understand and report, is a type of quantitative research called descriptive research, where we're looking at a population of interest and trying to understand one aspect of that population through some type of data collection. Now, it can be about entire species, groups, or odd facts about subsets of a population. Let's say I wanted to know the average speed of a cheetah or the average height of an NBA player or how much milk we could cram down our stomachs before having to puke. All of this is based on descriptive research. But again, social scientists don't always like to focus their attentions in these classes on descriptive research because it is very simplistic in nature, just talking about averages or the amount of spread of something. I'd much rather be able to talk about correlational studies or tests and experiments, things that we're going to be looking at as we progress in this class. But it is really important to note that before we move on from descriptive research, a large number of things that we find interesting, a large number of random facts that we learn actually come in this form. There are many other sciences that actually rely very heavily on descriptive research to understand different things within our world. It's just in psychology, we tend to focus our attention more on another type of quantitative research. That other type of quantitative research that we focus our attention on is what's sometimes called relationship research, where we're either looking at how well 2 or 3 or 4 variables that are somewhat quantitative in nature go together. We talked about the differences between nominal data and quantitative data in our last class, talking about interval, ratio, and ordinal data. That study, or studies that do focus on 2 sets of quantitative data, often is referred to as correlational research. Sometimes you can have 3 or 4 sets of data that you're interested in looking at the strength of those relationships between variables. In future classes, we'll talk about this thing called the correlation coefficient, measures of strength, measures of certainty. But for now, just know that this is one type of quantitative research that we can do, where we're looking not necessarily at what's causing something to change, but how well 2 things seem to go together just based on what we're calculating out. Something somewhat similar to this, it's still under the category umbrella of relationship research, is something we call comparison research, where we can take 2 disparate groups. These, again, are levels on what we would call a nominal variable, usually. Sometimes we can use ordinal variables as well, and compare them across some second variable of interest. Maybe it's the GPA of sophomores to seniors, or maybe it's an overall happiness rating of psych majors to sociology majors. That's comparison research. And when we're looking at this particular type of research, as we just kind of alluded to there in the descriptions that I gave, there's no true manipulation going on. It's very similar in nature to correlational research. In fact, a lot of the inferences we can make are similar to what we can do with correlational research. It's just there's some different statistical tools behind this comparison research. So we like to keep these things discrete, separate, so we can understand that even though there's a lot of overlap between them, there are some unique natures to both. If we're looking at another big thing, though, that we might aim to try to do in our comparison research that isn't inherent within all comparison research, we want to get to something that's going to be kind of a big topic that's going to be popping up throughout the rest of this class. The topic of something we call causation. Wanting to understand not only if something's happening in psychology, but why it's happening or what's caused that particular event to occur. Causation is a big aim for a lot of researchers looking at different psychological topics. And if we're looking for causation, we're looking to be able to explain not just how well 2 variables go together, but how changing one variable impacts another one. Well, we've got a lot of heavy lifting ahead of us. In essence, when trying to determine the direction of a relationship and able to say that one particular variable is impacting another, not just related to another, we need to run something called experimentation, where we're doing a series of different things in our studies to ensure that our statements about how one variable impacts another is not just based on hypotheses or kind of guessing what's going on. The first thing we need in any experimental study is some type of manipulation. We are running, just like before in comparison studies, analyses that try to compare multiple groups to each other. The key difference between an experiment and just a basic comparison study is that the groups are generated by the researchers. You're no longer comparing freshmen to seniors or psych majors to sociology majors. In experimental studies, when you have manipulation, you're comparing something like a control group to an experimental group, or a group that got blank versus a group that got some other blank, and how they perform after they've had those particular manipulations occur. This leads to another big component to experimentation, and that's that you need to then, of course, to compare groups, have some form of measurement of that second or third or however many variables you're interested in comparing. So you not only need to manipulate on what we've talked about before, it's the independent variable. You need to create some way to separate out the levels of that independent variable, but you have to have a measurement of a dependent variable, one that you can collect. And then from that, you can, of course, compare averages or different types of effects that you might be interested in examining in that measurement phase. Another key element to experimental studies, something that we're going to be visiting as you progress in multiple classes, is a need for what we call control. What that means is if we are going to manipulate things and we're going to compare groups, we also want to be mindful of anything outside of just our manipulation that could be causing some of the differences between the groups that we're finding. Let's say we have imbalance between the groups or something else that's unrelated to the manipulation at hand that could be impacting the effects that we have. We need to try to find ways to minimize these things. We need to try to essentially do something called control. We're going to talk about how we can control things as we're progressing in future classes. We'll also talk about some common pitfalls that people run into when they are attempting to control for things. But for now, let's just appreciate, understand that this is the fourth element to experimental studies: manipulation, measurement, comparison, and also some type of control. Now, if we do have all four of these things, we essentially have allowed ourselves to create those things that we've talked about before when discussing these things that we alluded to as experimental studies. We essentially have independent variables, usually just one, and dependent variables, usually again just one, but oftentimes we can occasionally run into studies where there's multiple dependent variables, multiple things that we think are being impacted by our independent variables. Remember, when we're talking about having independent variables, these are always just one particular thing that we're interested in that we've split up into separate groups. We could have, say, as we talked about earlier, different treatment conditions where one group gets a placebo, another group gets some particular type of drug or some type of manipulation, and a third group maybe gets a milder version of that. Right? Those different treatment conditions are not different independent variables. It's really important to keep those things distinct in your mind. In fact, some people struggled with this on the recent quiz. Different treatment conditions are different levels within whatever independent variable we're interested in measuring actually is. We could potentially have, excuse me, multiple independent variables. So maybe we've got three different groups that we've created, and then within those three different groups we've created three subgroups or two subgroups. Things can get sometimes very complex when you're dealing with multiple independent variables, but if you're talking about just the different conditions across whatever thing you're interested in, again, just to reiterate, if you're going to beat this into your heads, those different treatment conditions are different levels of whatever your independent variable is. The dependent variable is, again, that variable we're measuring in order to compare things. We want to be able to get averages, measures of spread, so we can test whether or not the groups that we've ourselves created are fundamentally different across this dependent variable of interest. As I mentioned, we're trying to control for those problems, those things that could potentially be shifting people in different directions, and that's completely independent of our independent variable. Essentially, we're trying to remove those horrible things called extraneous variables, sometimes also referred to as third variables. We'll see a couple other definitions of them as we progress, but we can just focus on those for now. This is what our goal is always in experimental studies: to set up independent variables, to measure dependent variables, while also controlling for these extraneous variables. What we were going to do in class, once we'd covered these particular things, is have us brainstorm some psychological concepts that we could actually explore in these experimental settings, talking about what our independent variable would be, what the experimental conditions or levels within that independent variable would be, what our dependent variable of interest would be, and how we might be able to control for some potential extraneous variables. That would allow us to really understand how experiments are unique and what makes them separate from these comparison studies, and also let us really understand what the bar is like for being able to talk about this thing called causation, something that many psychologists do obsess about trying to understand when looking at whatever topic they're interested in. Since we didn't have that time, we're going to kind of skip on to talking about some things we can do to maybe help researchers avoid some problems that we run into when we do try to run experimental studies. But people argue, even with what we found, we might not be able to infer causation. Essentially, we're just going to start dabbling in some of the different third or extraneous or variables that we could potentially run into along the way. One of the common problems that sometimes pops up in studies is this thing called experimenter bias. The experimenter, either intentionally or often unintentionally, influences the performance of his or her participants in a way that pushes people in the path that usually the experimenter is trying to accomplish. Maybe, say, an experimenter wants to show that a special set of instructions actually increases performance on some specific test. So they make sure that when they're giving this specific set of instructions, they're also giving lots of leeway on other things to help enhance scores of these participants, where they don't give those same extra enhancements in the other group. This is obviously a fairly unethical type of experimenter bias, but sometimes this can happen kind of unknowingly, where people don't necessarily intend to get people to move in the direction that they want, but they do move nonetheless. Well, the control for experimenter bias, usually researchers rely on something called a double-blind study, where the researchers themselves do not even know what particular group a person has been put into, and that means that the person themselves also do not know necessarily which group they've been put into in these experimental studies. This could involve things like people given written instructions for a study, so the researcher doesn't know if an instruction set is part of an experimental manipulation or maybe a control manipulation. If it's a drug study, it could involve the researchers and the participants not knowing whether or not somebody got a drug or a placebo. Of course, when you're running these double-blind studies, it's very critical to be able to eventually trace back what manipulation participants got. I've sadly heard of many people that have tried to run these double-blind studies to avoid experimenter bias, only to find that they actually don't have any way of tracking what manipulation somebody got, the placebo or the actual drug. So if you do these, just be mindful that you avoid that particular problem. The other, but kind of rare way of avoiding experimenter bias that could potentially pop up is people could maybe run what's called a single blind study, where the participants know which groups they're being placed into, which manipulations they're getting in comparison to other participants, but the researchers are kind of left in the dark. This is occasionally something that can happen as a single blind study, but usually when we're talking about a single blind study, we're talking about situations where the participants don't know which groups they're in, but the researchers actually do. When that particular type of single blind study is happening, it's usually to help prevent another particular problem, something that we call demand characteristics, where the participants themselves are changing their behaviors, either because they're trying to be insincere, they're trying to maybe dissuade the researcher from trying to manipulate them, or maybe they're even just trying to disprove whatever theory this researcher they think is trying to prove. There's a lot of different ways that demand characteristics can pop up, but one of the ways that researchers can help avoid these things from occurring, where they have people either helping out or not helping out, is by running these single-blind studies, where the participants don't necessarily know which group they're in. Another thing very closely linked to this particular approach is to have a study with what's called passive deception, where you're not necessarily withholding which manipulation group somebody's in, but instead you're withholding what types of manipulations are even going to be done in the first place. You're essentially not giving the participant everything they need to know to be able to figure out what would be the different types of things that could potentially pop up in the study. You maybe aren't telling people everything that you're measuring, or maybe you're not telling everybody about the types of manipulations that they're encountering. And in doing so, you're again trying to remove or at least diminish this third or extraneous variable that we call demand characteristics. What we were hoping to do here is spend then another 10-15 minutes talking about how, in those examples that we came up with in his groups, we could possibly run a single-blind study, or we could run a double-blind study. We'd also then break off and start discussing how passive deception might be possible in the studies that we were running. Of course, as you know, we don't really have the time to do this. So what we're going to do here is just really cut this extremely short, leave it at about 20-25 minutes. Now, that's extremely short video is here for a reason. Again, it's to kind of keep us up to speed, but it's here in this little package so you can watch this video maybe 2 or 3 times and really understand the information. So I encourage you, since we did compact this dramatically, to watch this a couple times, taking copious notes, and hopefully from it you can get everything that you could have gotten, if not more, from an in-person lecture. When we return, what we're going to be doing in our class on Tuesday is looking at 2 topics that we were going to potentially allude to in this class, something called validity and reliability, and then look at other concepts very closely related to some of the concerns that we started discussing in this class, namely some of those third and extraneous variable problems that happen. But for now, we're going to wrap up. So hopefully you got enough from this, and assuming that you did, I'll see you on Tuesday. Assuming I'll be back by Tuesday. I'll definitely be back by Tuesday for our next class. Have a great weekend, everybody.